Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, in Iran, a weak economy has triggered protests that have turned violent. How can Iran's leadership prevent the unrest from escalating? I speak to renowned Chinese poet Xi Chuan, who spread the work of his contemporary Haizi to a younger generation. I find out how he pioneered China's artistic renaissance of the 1980s. We begin today's program in Iran. For nearly 40 years, women in the country have been forced to cover their hair and wear long, loose garments. But police in the capital now announced that they will no longer arrest women for failing to observe the Islamic dress code. This upsets some of those hardliners opposed to the easing of such rules. Then somehow massive demonstrations pro and anti-government erupted and continued throughout the new year, focusing on dissatisfaction at the country's economy. Let's take a look at this background.
Protests in Iran continue and have even turned violent. Anti-government demonstrations started last Thursday and went on throughout the New Year holiday, with tens of thousands nationwide protesting the weak economy and later also taking aim at the country's leadership. President Hassan Rouhani addressed the nation at New Year's Eve, saying the government would allow critical voices to be heard, but that violence or the destruction of property is unacceptable.
One point must be made clear to everyone, that we are a free nation according to the Constitution and citizens' rights. People are absolutely free to criticize or even to protest. However, we should also be mindful that criticizing and protesting should be in such a way that it will result in improvement of the country's situation.
Observers say these could be the biggest demonstrations since the 2009 presidential election. At the same time, backers of the government also rallied to show their support. An Iranian official blamed the involvement of foreign agents for the unrest, which led to the deaths of 2 protesters in the western city of Beirut.
Regarding these clashes, we have found evidence of takfiri groups, government enemies and foreign services, which has been fully observed and led to the clashes. Evidence of foreign agents has been noticed. Regarding the clashes that killed 2 people, no shots were fired by the security forces and law enforcement. We have never fired upon the people. We wanted the protest to end in a peaceful way.
Just ahead of the massive protests, police in Iran's capital, Tehran, eased the dress code for women. This was in accordance to demands by the young and reform-minded Iranians who helped to re-elect President Hassan Rouhani, a relative moderate. Though there's no clear evidence that this has led to the massive protests in the first place, the Iranians taking to the streets are eager to embrace more drastic reforms in the new year.
First thing first, let's talk about the ease of regulations on women's dressing code in Iran. In Tehran, we invited Zainab Attali, an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Tehran. And in Washington, D.C., we have Nigar Mortazavi, who is a journalist for Iran International, which is an international TV channel based in London. I want to welcome both of you ladies to our program. Your reaction, very briefly, Ms. Tari, about the easing of regulations on the dressing code for women.
Well, I think if you look at this from perspective of Iranians living inside the country, it's different from those who would look at it from outside the country. It's not like such a very big news. It's not like, for example, the way you'll see that people will react to Saudi Arabian women having the right to drive. I actually read about this in an English news website. I'm not saying that it's important for part of the Iranian society, but it was not like such a big deal among many Iranians, because I don't think many of us deal with this issue on a daily basis, and that I think many of us were having our life as we had before.
Okay. Ms. Mortazavi, from outside Iran, how do you see that? You're originally from Iran, though.
Yes, I'm from Iran. I'm in touch with a lot of Iranians on the ground, women and men. I think from the viewpoint of women who are not supportive of a mandatory hijab, of forcing this dress code of them, this is a very important move Of course, if you observe the hijab, the mandatory portion of it might not be an issue, but for millions of young Iranians, women who are against the mandatory status, this is an important move. There has been constant struggle, constant back and forth with the morality police. There have been some very unfortunate incidents of arrest and of just violence on the streets that if this is going to change, I think it is going to be a very big move.
So do you think this is any political message in a way, Ms. Mortazavi? Is this going to be a political message coming from the administration in Iran right now? Or is this going to be also a message coming from the religious community in Iran, Mr. Mortazavi?
I think it's both. It's a socio-political and somewhat religious message because this rule is based on a religious promise, and I think it's showing a little bit of an easing of the tensions that has existed in the society regarding this issue, and because of the pushback that women have done in the past 4 decades against this mandatory status. If you look at how Iranian women dressed in the 80s and the 90s after the revolution, it was much stricter and the laws were much stricter compared to how young women are dressed right now. So I think it's a combination of all of these messages, and it has to be attributed to the moderate administration of President Rouhani to some extent, as well as the women.
Ms. Tari, though, many are concerned whether this is going to be a sustained policy or this is likely to be temporary because we see the ups and downs of politics in Iran. Ms. Tari.
I would like to say one point about what Ms. Mortazavi said, that millions of Iranians are happy about this. Unfortunately, we don't have any statistics about favorability rate of hijab inside Iran, so it's not easy to give any statistics on this issue. And also, I would like to go back to the history of hijab. The hijab, I mean, I don't want to go to details, but hijab actually goes back before Islamic Revolution. People would argue that during the Iranian ancient times, hijab did existed. And then even during the many of these women who started to wear hijab, they actually started a decade before Iranian Revolution because it was considered to be a sign of resistance against imperialism. So I'm trying to say that this hijab is not an invention of the Islamic Republic. It goes back to the Iranian tradition in history. And also it was not only a traditional religious sign, it was also a political sign and symbol for many Iranians at that time.
But also, Ms. Tari, you do understand that it has been an enforcement of wearing it in recent decades. The enforcement itself is what rather was a very clear political and religious message, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Hijab is compulsory in Iran. But then, again, I think if, for example, when foreigners come inside Iran, they would be surprised. They would see many Iranian fashionable, women who are having the latest fashions in Europe or the U.S., or they are having this colorful, sorts of hijab or minimum hijab sometimes.
Yeah,
so I'm trying to say that this is not like Saudi Arabia or uniform way of wearing, clothes.
Is there misconceptions? Misunderstanding, Ms. Mortazavi, coming from outside Iran about really what's going on inside Iran? Is that being, wrongly painted by the so-called Western media? It seems that's what Ms. Tari has been suggesting.
Yes, there's a lot of misconception, and some of it is attributed to the coverage of the media, but it's also access. Let's not forget that the establishment in Iran does not give easy access to Western and international media and journalists to go inside Iran and cover Iranian stories freely.
In the future, Ms. Tari, if the regulation continues to be what it is today, will more Iranian women without religious restrictions be able to take off this so-called headdress and completely just be themselves, even though you could say you're also being yourself because that's what you choose?
I just want to make one point, is that this dichotomy of having like a veiled society, which is like more progressive, and unveiled society, which is backward. This is basically inaccurate, and it should be questioned by like I think Iranians, or like any woman who is wearing headscarf inside or outside the country. So for example, the case of Iran itself, if you compare pre-revolutionary Iran, then actually hijab was not enforced, and in a sense it was not encouraged. You will see that, like for example, literacy rate was very low, and that's why actually if you compare it with the post-revolutionary Iran, you see literacy rate increase, higher education among women, like almost over 60% of female students now are graduates are female students, and then like over health issues, the number of children women are having, marriage age, all of this improved after the 1979 revolution, which imposed hijab in a sense. So I'm trying to say that we should not take it like a reductivist approach, that we have to reduce all these liberties to hijab, and if they have hijab, so they don't have liberties or freedom.
Ms. Mortazavi, very briefly, final words from you. If we look at the dress code alone, are we only looking at the issue in Iran skin deep? Or this is going to be a great entry point to look at the great changes going on, if there are any, in Iran?
I think, like Ms. Sari said, there is the trajectory. The change has been happening gradually with the pushback of women. This is not something that came top down as far as an easing of the restrictions. In fact, the restrictions on hijab were very strict in the 80s and 90s. And then after the war, as it was correctly pointed, the easing started and the pushback became harder and harder with the younger generation just wanting, like you said, to take off the headscarf, even though it is very minimal when you look at the dress code. So I think this is part of a gradual change. Some people might argue that it might not be a very important anchor point, but if Iranian women can rest assured that they're not going to be arrested on the street for the way their hijab or their dress code is, I think it's going to be an ease of mind for a long time to come, and not just for the women, but for the entire society.
We see Nigar Mozazavi and also Zainab Tali. Thank you so much for both of you helping us understand better about the issue of headscarf in Iran, what it means for the rest of the society. Thank you for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We're going to continue our discussions about the latest situation in Iran, including the recent protests. Iran's economy recently shrank in the past 3 years. The GDP contracted 23% in the year 2016 from 2013, the year President Rouhani took office, according to data from Iran's Statistical Center. Inflation decelerated from a crippling 40% in 2013 to a more manageable 9.6% last year. Rouhani singled out the lack of investment due to decades of Western sanctions for the economy's retreat. So what exactly is the situation in Iran, whether the economic situation is contributing to the dissatisfaction of the public about the government, and how to see the recent protests going on there? We are joined in our Beijing studio, He Wenping, Professor and Director of African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In Tehran, we invited Mohammad Morandi, Professor and Dean of the World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran. And in Washington, D.C., we welcome back Nigar Mortazavi, a journalist for Iran International, which is an international TV channel based in London. Welcome back to the three of you. Professor Morandi, first of all, I want you to have some explanation to us about exactly what's going on the streets of Iran with the protests.
Well, what we did have initially a few days ago was were protests that were more or less about economic issues, austerity, and a couple of banks or financial institutions that had collapsed. And a significant number of people lost their money as a result. And the protests were about that. And we've had such protests in the past before. Usually people would gather in front of Parliament or other such institutions and make their case. But gradually, what we also saw alongside these protests were smaller groups of people who were more radical, they were much more political, and often violent as well. And over the last few days, we've had a decrease in the size of the economic protests,
right.
And those people have been sort of stepping aside, and we've had a more significant role being played by the more radical protests, which, as I said, have also been quite violent. They have, as President Rouhani has spoken yesterday, they have created a lot of destruction to public property, and they took a fire engine last night and pushed it down a road, killing 3 people, the rioters. So President Rouhani has warned that these protests have to come to an end. Peaceful protests and protests about without violence is, of course, the right of the people, but these sort of protests are, he says, not going to be tolerated.
Mr. Mortazavi, of course, looking from outside, the people are very concerned about what exactly is going on.
It's not just about the economy. There's a lot of political messages. The protests are getting very radical, and it's just an anger and dissent at the status quo that the Iranians see as a mismanagement in both the political and economic sector of the entire establishment over decades. So this is one portion of it, and unfortunately it's gotten violent, and as you said, the national media has reported at least 10 people dead during the protests, and we see some very violent scenes. And as we saw in 2009 also, the security forces are very capable of shutting down and repressing protests, which they did in 2009, so it might happen again this time
Professor
around.
Morandi, how big a test is this going to be, the Rouhani administration?
So when President Rouhani speaks about foreign interference, he does have a case, and I'm sure he's also, since the intelligence organizations are answerable to him, he also has other forms of information. But it's ironic that the Americans behave like this.
If that is the case, Professor Morandi, do you think it is part of the overall picture that the other sides, I mean, the United States with some of its allies, Saudi Arabia and some of the others in the region, part of their actions and interactions among themselves in order to deal with Iran, is that some bigger picture you're looking at, or this is just part of the, the ongoing way that the Western countries, as Iran sees it, is dealing with Iran?
I think it works both ways. By the way, I'm not saying that there are not legitimate grievances and that there are not ordinary protests and that people are not unhappy with the economic performance of the administration or previous administrations. But the point is that people that, from what I'm seeing, they're very much against these riots. But yes, I think that you have a point in that there is a broader picture.
All the regional players want to sharpen their hands in order to play a bigger role in their advantage. This is more than any time before, with the U.S. so-called withdrawal from many of the issues. Ms. He, how do you see the latest situation going on in Iran, both the protests and the bigger picture between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and some of the others?
Yes, I think there's no doubt right now that Iran is under even more pressure than before. Because before, he only needs to handle those international pressure, like from U.S., like from Saudi, from Israel, and also he wants to play his part of role, especially in the Syria. So because in Syria, he has been fighting so many years, and also in Yemen. But now suddenly, something now happening within itself. So those kind of protests, I think, is not only just one city, and now it's becoming more. So I think the pressure, of course, is getting higher and getting heavier for the government. Not only, like my colleagues in Tehran has mentioned, now it's just not only the economic issue. Now we have seen a lot of political, those slogans, those demands, even goes directly to those foreign policy. Goes to the foreign policy towards like Syria, towards Yemen. So that makes people also have this kind of link, those think, gas, no matter it's a gas or a rumor or whatever. So with who is behind those scenarios, I think it's natural to think over those so-called enemies for Iran, like U.S., like Saudi, like Israel.
I see.
Yeah, so that's the challenge. So far we cannot foresee how long that the Iranian government can handle this and how many measures they need to take. And so we still need to wait and see.
Right. Ms. Mortazavi, though, in Washington, what would that mean? I mean, somewhat degrees of instability with this protest in Iran. For the region, as we know, it is so-called a stabilizing anchor, even though it has very strong and clear political motive of its own. I mean, the country of Iran itself.
Yes, well, compared to the neighboring countries, you see Afghanistan immediately to the east. There's a war in Iraq, and some of the other neighboring countries. Iran is considered one of the stable countries. It's a large country, it's a powerful country in the region, but at the same time, the involvement in some of the tensions in the Middle East, as mentioned in Syria, for example, one of the slogans on the street these days is "No to Gaza, no to Lebanon, and I only die for Iran," which is essentially a criticism of the funding and of the backing, including financial support for these groups in like Hezbollah and Hamas in Gaza and Lebanon, while Iranians are having these type of economic problems within the country. So these are all things that have made the populace angry.
What will all of this mean, Professor Morandi? I mean, you heard from our Washington guest that in some of the so-called slogans was talking about not letting Iran playing a bigger role in the neighboring countries anymore. In other words, Iran's strategy in the greater Middle East might not be agreed by some of these protesters. So what would that mean for Iran's overall approach for the future?
Well, again, as I said, when on campus we have those debates. In society, we've always had those debates. The problem that these protesters are creating for the country, and by the way, their numbers are decreasing, and I don't think this is going to last much longer. And if you look at the footage, they are small groups of people. But the problem that they're creating is that they're not doing this through civil society institutions. They're not speaking through dialogue.
Okay.
They're attacking banks. They've attacked fire departments. They've destroyed buildings, and they've attacked even police stations.
All right.
So this debate is a legitimate debate. Within Iran, different newspapers have different positions on Iran's Syrian position, Iran's Iraq position, and that debate is healthy and should be continued. But rioting is something that I think that the overwhelming majority of Iranians disagree with, and I think that's one reason why this is going to fizzle out. But Western countries that are supporting this, as President Rouhani said, they can't expect to have better relations with Iran and do this at the same time.
Mohammad Morandi, Nigar Mortazavi, and He Wenping, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. A brilliant poet in his own right, Xi Chuan also popularized the seminal work of his contemporary Haizi to a younger generation. Meet the poet up close after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. In the 1980s, just as China was beginning to give the world a glimpse of its rich heritage, literature and the arts was blossoming among the youngest generation. Many brilliant young poets at the time breathed life into the words that moved, inspired, and enlightened and invigorated readers. Earlier, I spoke with one of China's contemporary poets, Xi Chuan. He shared his unique insight as a wordsmith and how he approaches his and his peers' work with such poetic license. Most notably, he introduced the seminal work of his contemporary Haizi to a wider audience. Before the exclusive interview, take a look at this first.
Some say poetry is either genius or madness. In late 20th century, China has seen several outstanding poets. Their works are immortalized in people's mind and have inspired generations after them. Debasement is the password of the base, nobility the epitaph of the noble. I love not only your statelessness, but also your firm stand, the earth beneath you. Even with these dark eyes, a gift of the dark night, I go to seek the shining light. Among them, Haizi is one of the most beloved poets who committed suicide at the age of 25. His death is regarded as a turning point in contemporary Chinese literature. As his best friend, poet Xi Chuan has edited the complete poems of Haizi, which includes illustrations drawn by Haizi himself.
Haizi's poem in Chinese. 黑夜从大地上升起，遮住了光明的天空。丰收后荒凉的大地，黑夜从你内部上升。你从远方来，我到远方去，遥远的路程经过这里。黑夜一无所有，为何给我安慰？
Although his poetic oeuvre is relatively small, his archetypal descriptions of the rural and natural world, now virtually extinguished by industrialization, have a lyric intensity that is richly evocative. At that passionate and romantic age, the two poets shared a great time.
Because I know that Haizi is a genius. There's a young artist, young stage director. Every year she directs a play in memory of Haizi. And she always used the word genius. And I told her, for you, genius is a word. For me, that's a person with flesh. I feel that I was lucky to be Haizi's friend and Luo Yihe's friend in 1980s.
You are not just a friend. You are actually the one who worked very hard to push their poetry in front of the public eyes. You were a promoter.
I'm the editor of Haizi's complete poems, the book. That is about 1,100 pages. So that's a thick book, like a dictionary.
What about that complete work of Haizi? When you were editing it?
At that time, I didn't have a laptop or a computer, so I have to copy his poems in handwriting. So usually I worked for 1 week in copying his poems, and then I stopped for 1 week, and then I need a week for my own writing, and then next week should be a week for Haizi. And sometimes I felt that Haizi, he wrote some dreadful poems about ghosts, about bones, about these things. So I remember that one night I had to stop in writing. And I have to stop to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I felt that I should stop in doing this if a ghost will emerge suddenly. But then after 10, nothing happened. So I went on with my work in editing his poems. And that was also a hard time for me. And suddenly I felt that I was alone in this world. And also I was at a loss. Not only because of Haizi and Luo Yihe's deaths, but also because of the big change of the Chinese society.
I remember you were talking about yourself and the way you felt about yourself. You said you, quote, became a useless man. That was the time when you lost your 2 friends?
I don't know. Later I feel that I became a blind person. In 1980s, I felt that I had aims or one big aim, that is to be a writer, to be a poet, and to know whom you are. But later I lost this aim. So I told others that I became a blind person. I have to confess to myself that I don't know who I am. And I need to understand myself, not only about me, myself, but also about the society, also about the history, also about the life and death.
What about the society? What about the history? What questions you were urgently looking for answers?
About God. Although I'm not a Christian.
Religious?
No, I'm not religious. But let me take this as an example. Before, I felt that I know the face of God. But later I felt that maybe I need to know something about the back of God. And then I tried to turn to the back of God to see to see it. So it's
Is the end of naivety?
Yeah, that's a good word. Naivety.
Or the end of the innocence? Those are very...
Oh yes, that's a good word. You know, English poet William Blake, and William Blake said that a person at the beginning of his life, he lived an innocent life, and then he had to get into a step of experience or experiences. So I felt that in 1990s, I stepped onto this step of experience, and he had a poem called Tiger. So tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. But then he had another poem that is Lamb. And so he took lamb and on the one hand, and the other hand is tiger.
And since then, you become a tiger or a lamb? I just want to use analogy, because are you a totally different person since then? You graduated in a way?
I don't know how to put it, but before I understood bright things, luminous things. But
aspirations.
Later, yes. And but later I felt that I need to know something about the evil things and the dark side of life.
Did you have any points about that?
Oh.
Yourself being, in a way, very observing?
Yeah, later I got an ability, I have to say, I got an ability of understanding absurdities.
Do you like yourself the one you had back in the 1980s? Or you like yourself even better after you see or after you saw the back of the God?
You know, young people, younger than me, they sometimes ask me to tell them some stories about from 1980s. But I always tell them that I'm not a person who's always feel nostalgia for 1980s. I think only those people who had accomplished their jobs. So I think it is their right to think about 1980s again and again. But me, I feel that I'm a person still working. Still walking and working. And so I seldom go back to 1980s.
Not one to be comfortable dwelling in the past, Xi Chuan, the well-respected Chinese contemporary poet, exposed himself to all kinds of uncertainties and unknowns. He began to play with new ideas in his poetry, experiments one after another for reincarnation. Unlike many of his generation of poets who eventually left, he dares to persevere in his life and work as a poet.
Poetry and history, or between poetry and philosophy, or between poetry maybe a religion or something else.
That's very interesting.
Between us.
Can you give us some examples?
After 1992, I started to write prose poems. And lots of Chinese readers, they were not used to my way of writing after 1992. And they feel that that's not poetry. Because ordinary people, they understand that poetry should be in lines with rhymes.
You want to break that?
Yeah, I want to.
What did you do?
I brought some ideas into poetry writing. I feel that poetry is not, poetry, this word is not only for lyrical poetry, because usually people feel that to talk about, to give ideas, that's a task of philosophers. But I feel that poets also have, they need to at least to know something about these philosophical things. Yeah. I have a series of poems. There's one, the title is What the Ego Says. I'm trying to talk in a crazy way, I have to say. Oh, I have another series of poems that is, I try to give definitions to words. For instance, bird. And bird, you have a definition in a dictionary. And I'm trying to give new definitions. I invented. Not only about birds, about city, about this term city, this word, about what else? Fire or shadow. And I try to give the definition in a very official way. But
Xi Chuan way. Xi Chuan's official version.
But what I talk there, what I have there, could be something absurd.
We are very much looking forward to listening to those poems.
Yeah. Grandmother. My grandmother coughs, waking 1,000 roosters. 1,000 roosters crow, waking 10,000 people. 10,000 people walk out of the village. Roosters in the village still crowing. The crowing roosters stop. My grandmother still coughing. My still coughing grandmother mentions her grandmother, her voice getting softer. As if it were my grandmother's grandmother's voice getting softer. My grandmother talks and talks, then stops, shutting her eyes, as if it were only now that my grandmother's grandmother really died.
What interests you the most these days that you would like eventually put it on paper?
I've just finished a very long essay on Tang poetry.
From China's Tang Dynasty?
Tang Dynasty, yes. Chinese people, it seems that the Chinese people had a definite way of in reading these poets. So I'm trying to tell something new, to tell something fresh, to give new ways in reading these poets.
But why? I mean, Xi Chuan, why? Chinese society is changing so fast.
Yes.
Why do you have to go back?
Actually, you've given me the answer. That is, the Chinese society changed so rapidly, and then because of this, right? Because of this, I am having a way of looking at Tang Dynasty society.
What do you mean by that?
For instance, what's the relationship between poetry writing and the social changes? And you can't read Tang poetry only according to, only as dead poems, only as knowledge. But they are heritages for us. But the poets from Tang Dynasty, when they were writing the poems, they were writing just like us writing at this time. The social changes, well, gives me such an opportunity to find something new there in Tang poetry.
What did you find?
Because, for instance, in Tang Dynasty, there are also monk poets. And so beside Li Bai and Du Fu, there were poets like Han Shan, who's very famous in other countries, in the United States, in Europe. His name was translated into like this, the Cold Mountain. But in Chinese, that's Han Shan. And, but Han Shan was not the only monk poet from Tang Dynasty. There's another person, his name is Wang Fanzhi. and also a very famous monk of Zen Buddhism, Huineng. They wrote, because Tang poets, they were elites, but these monk poets, they wrote with a kind of vernacular Chinese. They were away from the mainstream of the Tang dynasty. And that, for me, that's quite interesting.
It's very interesting to talk about, you got to know the God at the very beginning when you were very young. And then you got to know, as you see it, the back of the God. And now, it seems that you try to see within yourself.
Yeah, I also want to know my limitations. So my possibilities and also my limitations. I have to say that my brain is crowded with concepts from the Western world. Well, then I traveled to countries like India, like Turkey, like Egypt. Because of my experiences of traveling to these less advanced countries, I feel that maybe the whole issue is not so simple.
That is Xi Chuan, one of the most well-known Chinese contemporary poets, who tries very hard to piece together the real picture of reality and history through his works. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.